So, hi. Uh, brief introduction. I think I know almost all of you, and I think you all know me by this point. Which means, it feels almost like I should, given that you know what I'm going to say, I should have written this as a limerick or something to keep your attention. I'll do it for next class. This time, I'll just tell you who I am. I'm Bex Stern Rosenblatt. I'm the North American faculty in residence for the conservative yeshiva at the Fuchsburg Jerusalem Center. And yes, if you try and print that on a little business card, it like runs off. It's so long. But what that means is I do a ton of teaching online for the Fuchsburg Jerusalem Center, which is, as you might guess from the title, located in Jerusalem. And we do also have fantastic in-person teaching. Should you find yourself in Jerusalem, or if you're looking for an excuse to go to Jerusalem, this is it. This is the moment you've been waiting for. Go get on a plane, come learn with us. And then the last thing is, if you say, well, no, I don't want to get on a plane myself and go to Jerusalem, but I want to bring a little taste of learning to my synagogue or to my Hillel or to whatever sort of community I'm part of. That's me. That's where you email me and you bring me to your synagogue or wherever you're located, and I tap dance for you in person. Although my tap dancing skills are roughly equivalent to, I don't know, my 1.5-year-old's ability to use a fork. Okay. Anyway, let's get started. I'm going to share the source sheet with y'all in the chat. Reba, that is a wonderful excuse about why it's dark. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to give you a very short introduction, and then we're going to start learning the text together. When we get to the text, as always, we're creating meaning together. Y'all, I am going to be mining your brains and constructing a meaning. So I do need your videos on, and I do need you all to talk. When you have something to say, please raise your actual hand or raise your Zoom hand, and I will call on you. I will try not to mispronounce your names, but mispronouncing names is one of my specialties, so sorry in advance. And when you talk, you're in and out. You're 2 sentences, you make your point, you're pithy. If you've written a limerick, even better. If you have a big long thesis you want to share, if this is something you've thought about deeply, and you've got your magnum opus, your theory of life, the universe, and everything to share on this topic, that is incredible. But I'm the teacher of this class, so you put that magnum opus in the chat, or you email me, and I'd love to read it. But when I call on you, you've got 2 sentences and you're out. Cool. All right. So here we are approaching Tisha B'Av, approaching the date on which we commemorate the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem the first time around, the date on which we commemorate the destruction of the temple the second time around, the date on which we think about the Spanish Inquisition, the date on which basically everything bad in Jewish history ever has happened, this day where we devote ourselves to mourning, to thinking about the worst that's happened. And it's this incredibly powerful day. And this incredibly powerful tradition to say, okay, there's once a year on which I'm going to let myself mourn for all of the bad. If you've read the Book of Lamentations with me, which a number of you have, you'll know that one of the things that's really incredible about Tisha B'Av, about the Jewish tradition on this day, is that it's not just me, Bex, sitting here in 2023 being like, ah, yes, well, those people in Jerusalem, they sure suffered. That sure sucked to be them. Instead, we're doing this like almost magical thing on Tisha B'Av, where we're mourning as if we were the people in each of these tragedies. We're becoming the people sitting there looking at destroyed Jerusalem. We're becoming the people who've lost our fathers and our brothers and our children. We're becoming the people who were expelled, exiled in the Spanish Inquisition. And when we're mourning from this place of deep identification with them. We're sitting with them and mourning. And it's similar to what happens during a Shiva, like you get down on the level of the mourners, right? That we are joining all of Jewish history in our mourning. So what we're going to do today is read the part of the Midrash on the Book of Lamentations, where the big question going on is, well, why does all this bad stuff happen, right? Like, okay, lovely, we have a good way of dealing with it. We can understand grief, we can make sense of grief, we can move through grief. But wouldn't it be better if we just didn't have to do that in the first place? If we have this all-powerful God, why is God doing this to us? And for those of you who were learning with us last week, we saw that God's response in the same Petikta, the same part of the Midrash that we'll be reading today, God's first response was to cry. And it's this heart-wrenching cry, right? It's this God's like, I have to cry. And the angels, Metatron comes and it's like, oh, excuse me, don't cry. Doesn't look good. You're going to ruin your mascara. And God says, excuse me, if you don't let me cry here, I'm going to lock the door and you won't be able to have access to me. And I'm going to cry and cry and cry. And so when we think about Midrash, this is something written by rabbis Midrash in general is written in the 300s to 1000 AD. This particular Midrash on Lamentations is written in 300 to 500 AD, likely. And it's written to answer these difficult theological questions, but it's also very different from Tanakh, right? Tanakh is meant to be received, the audience is meant to read Tanakh as if it happened, as if it were true. And in Midrash, we don't need to think it's true, right? When we read about God crying, we don't need to think, okay, this literally happened. Rather, we're providing ourselves comfort, we're providing ourselves a framework for making sense of the world intentionally. And so one of the things that Midrash does is it offers us a bunch of different possibilities, a bunch of different scenarios to help us make sense. So for those of you who were here last week, we read about God crying in response. This week, we're going to read about the patriarchs and their response to destruction. So we're about to jump into the text. This is my final call. And this, I'm quoting Song of Songs at you now, and like I can see like 4 of you who have learned Song of Songs with me. So bonus points if you get it. Let me see your face. We got 31 people here learning with us right now, and a bunch more on Facebook. And hello, lovely faces. Because we'll read it and then y'all are gonna talk. This is way too long for me talking at you. Tov. So I'll post the source sheet in the chat once more. I'm not going to share the source sheet because then I don't get to see y'all, and that's the whole point for me. But we're going to start out. So, one final comment before we get started. I'm going to refer to God as he the whole time. That is how God is presented in this particular Midrash. It doesn't need to be how you think of God, like the God you pray to, the God your relationship, if that God exists, doesn't need to reflect my personal theology, but the God as a character in this text can be a he, and that's all right. Okay, so we're going to get started. And what you'll notice as we go through this Midrash is a ton of it is about relationship parent-child. So we'll read the first box. We're going to be working mostly with the English. I'll take us back to the Hebrew or Aramaic at some points when it's relevant, but for the most part, we'll be working with the English, and it is not my translation. So don't blame me when it sounds funny. Would somebody want to get us started? First box, reading it in the English. Stuart, go for it.
The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Jeremiah, "Today I am like a man who had just one son, and he made a chuppah for his son, but his son died under his chuppah. And you cannot understand this pain, not for me and not for my son. Go and call Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses from their grave, for they know how to cry."
Thank you, Stuart. Y'all, this is just, I almost have nothing to say here. Just, it's so powerful, right? It's call these four people, for they know how to cry. And my first question is why dafka these four? What does it mean that these four know how to cry? Why might God be coming and saying these four know how to cry, and you, Jeremiah, not so much? What is it? What might it be about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses that's different from Jeremiah? What is their connection to crying? And y'all have learned with me in the past, there's not a right answer here. There's a possibility of answers that we're throwing up. Not throwing up on an invisible board. So if you have ideas, raise your hand, physical hand, raise your Zoom hand. What is it about these four? Why is God looking to these four? Because they know how to cry. What does that mean? They know how to cry. Stuart, get us started.
Well, first of all, God has had a covenantal relationship with all four of them. And second of all four of them have suffered tragic loss.
Interesting. Okay, covenant 1, 2. These are people who, even if you haven't read about them crying, we know that they have had stuff in their life they should have cried about. Yafe. Okay, Sylvia.
There we go. Yes, and I think for all four of them, they've had, it's not just stuff that shouldn't have happened. They had loss of family, they had loss of land, but mostly of family and people that are close to them. And also in that covenantal relationship, Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son. I mean, that is huge. The fact that it didn't happen was pretty huge too. But how traumatic can it be? And then the second thing with Abraham is Sodom and Gomorrah. He lost the rest of his family. He lost his nephew. Was his nephew? His nephew and all these people. Because he was, I mean, his whole life was as a is a series of losses. The
Really,
land, people, it's, and Moses too. He lost everything. And then got other rewards, but he lost things.
great. Okay. And just clarification there. Lot doesn't die in this.
Yeah, I know. It's the other guy.
Okay.
The rest of them.
Oh, got it. The problem with me teaching said text is I laughed too much. But yeah, so we have incredible personal loss of family that's special about these four people. Yeah, Benny.
You can say that all four of them have had that exact experience where they're in relationship to their people. They were father figures. They had the chuppah. The sons or the people that were close to them died in that kind of relationship. So I think it's a way to kind of understand how God is feeling when you can relate to our forefathers, because the way Moses has been praying with like the golden calf, for instance, all his children was about to die, and he pleaded with God not to do it or erase himself. I mean, they even have taken that step. So I think it's the depth of grief that these four names have in common with because what does it mean that God it feels a bit abstract, but when you think about the forefathers and their lives and Moses added to it, then of course it comes more to a something we can recognize and identify.
Great. Okay. So this is Dafka about losing a son, losing a child. That we have here the mashal, the parable, the example that God gives us about I am similar to a man who has built a chuppah for his son, and then the son died under the chuppah. And that's this incredibly powerful image that brings us back to like, I built the temple and my children died, like defending the temple. And Benny, you're saying, yeah, and all Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the Moses have all experienced something like loss of a child. Okay, Francine and then Ellie.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that Jacob witnessed the loss of the population in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he bargained with God, and basically he couldn't bargain enough, and he saw the destruction of the cities.
Okay, so then I think you meant to say Abraham there, right? Abraham saw that stuff. Yeah, awesome. So it's Abraham's witness destruction on a scale that is similar to the destruction of Jerusalem. Abraham has witnessed full scale destruction. Okay, Ellie. Oh, no, not yet. Unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering, I may be completely off, but when God tells to Jeremiah to go get these patriarchs, doesn't he think that and he tells him, because you don't know how to cry? Maybe Jeremiah has not suffered as those people have.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah. Tell me a little bit more about that. What's the difference between Jeremiah and those four?
Because God is talking to Jeremiah, and God is instructing him to go talk to the patriarchs about because they know how to cry, as if Jeremiah does not know how to cry.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's almost funny here. Like Jeremiah, y'all know like the epithet that often goes with him. He's like Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. Jeremiah is like known for his ability to cry. The thing we know about Jeremiah is he cries all the time. And according to Jewish tradition, Jeremiah is the one who wrote, who spoke the Book of Lamentations, which is all this cry, which is crying and crying and crying. Like Jeremiah is the biblical epitome of somebody who cries. And yet, here God's saying, hey, Jeremiah, you do not know how to cry. I need Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, because they know how to cry. And I think we're onto something when you say, well, yeah, because they all have experienced something like the loss of a child. Jeremiah didn't have children. Jeremiah may have felt some sort of fatherhood for the people of Israel, the people of Judah, but he didn't have actual children in the way that these four did. Tov. Other final thought here, anybody? Yeah, Rosalind. Make sure you unmute.
I think the under the chuppah part of it is significant
Okay.
because I actually just went to a wedding. It wasn't my family member, but it was longtime friends. It's a moment of fulfillment, and you expect things to go on to the next generation. And in general, you're expecting wonderful things to happen from the wedding. And yet, all of these people know what it's like to not just lose people, but lose the promise of something important.
Fantastic.
Along with their personal grief.
Fantastic, Rosalind. So taking us back to who said that at the very beginning about the thing that makes these people special is the covenant relationship they have, and also that they've lost a child. So Rosalind, you're uniting those two here with the idea of chuppah. It's that there's a promise with the chuppah, and that promise is broken when the child dies. Yafeh, the covenant is broken in some way. And that's, I mean, we see that a lot in the Book of Lamentations. This is like, how could you do this? Yes, it's in the covenant, but this is beyond. This is too much. You've overstepped the rules. You've overstepped the like, if this, then that of the covenant. Okay, cool. Thank you, Rosalind. All right, quickly, Stuart, and then we're going to keep moving.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but Jeremiah was an eyewitness to the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BCE. So I mean, he witnessed plenty of destruction and experienced plenty of suffering. I mean, it's not like he was exempt from it.
Yes, he's like, this is the guy who has seen the worst happen. This is the guy who wrote Lamentations. This is the crying prophet. This is, I mean, y'all, the opening verse of Lamentations 3, Ani hagever ra'a oni b'shevet evrato. And this, imagine Jeremiah speaking, I am the man who has seen affliction I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. That's Jeremiah talking. This is a guy who has suffered. And God's saying, your suffering is not what I need. I need the suffering of a parent. Ellie, and then we'll
Just a quick question. Why would he, well, it's implied that he doesn't know how to cry. That's how I took it, like an implication.
Great. Okay, fantastic. So last week, for those of you who were here, it seemed as if God was like the ultimate crier. We had this example of God who cries, who weeps. And here it seems like perhaps God is calling the forefathers and Moses to teach God how to cry, to do something that God doesn't know how to do. And we'll get to that as we continue the text. Thank you for bringing it up. Okay, so next box, for the sake of time, I'm just going to read the boxes from now on. Although it was lovely when you read it, Stuart, thank you. Okay. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, when the temple was destroyed, Abraham came before the Holy One, blessed be he, weeping, pulling out his beard, tearing out the hair of his head, striking his face, rending his garments, ashes on his head. and he was walking in the temple and lamenting and screaming, which is zoacking, crying out. He said before the Holy One, blessed be he, why am I different from all nations and tongues that I have come to the state of shame and humiliation? So God says, Jeremiah, call Abraham. Jeremiah goes, calls all these Abraham and co, and Abraham comes, and he's sofed v'zoek, he's lamenting and weeping, and he's also engaging in all of these mourning practices. Something that's interesting about the mourning practices here is some of them are explicitly forbidden, right? We do not do some of these things. We don't pull out our hair, we don't strike our faces. We're told not to do that when we mourn. And yet Abraham is doing it here. And one way that that gets interpreted is Abraham's not mourning the loss of a person, Abraham's mourning the loss of something much, much bigger. And those biblical prohibitions against self-harm and mourning are only relevant to loss of a person. And that when you get to the next level, you definitely need these next level ways of expressing grief, which is interesting. Okay. So I'm going to read the next box. Abraham continues. God doesn't answer him here. And we'll see that for all of the Midrash that we read today, God is not going to respond, just as God does not respond in the Book of Lamentations. So God doesn't respond, and Abraham continues saying, Master of the universe, why did you exile my children, deliver them into the hands of the nations, kill them with all kinds of uncommon deaths, and destroy the temple, the place where I elevated my son, Isaac, as a burnt offering before you? Okay, and this is this midrashic thing where we imagine that the temple is the same place where basically everything's ever happened, so that the place where Abraham bound Isaac happened, Mount Moriah is the same place where we eventually built the temple. So we have these two questions that Abraham has asked here. He says, why am I different that I've come to this state of shame? And why did you do this in the place where I offered Isaac? What's interesting here? What's the force of those questions? What's Abraham asking? What's bothering him? Why does he cry out to God? Why these questions? What's the point of these questions? Stuart, starting us off yet again.
I think partly Abraham is throwing the notion of chosenness back in God's face, because back in Genesis, if I recall, God promised Abraham, like, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed. And now it's completely the opposite. Awesome. So back to that idea of covenant. This is what we were chosen for. I mean, y'all familiar with Fiddler on the Roof? Like, no, we're the chosen people, but every once in a while, can't you choose somebody else? Like, we've been chosen here for suffering. We've been chosen, I think, where is it? This idea of like being killed in uncommon ways, but call me tot mishunot. Like, it's just this like, this is the way we're special, is we're special in the ways we get to die. It's horrible. Yeah. Diane asks, great. Why does Abraham feel the shame and humiliation? Like, why is he talking about that he should feel, I'm different in that I should feel shame, busha, uchlima. What is this shame and humiliation about? Why is Abraham complaining of shame and humiliation? Sylvia. Oh, make sure you unmute.
Just saw that. Thank you. He's the father. And as a parent, what our children do and how they come out often reflect on us. That's number one. And number two, you're losing you're not just losing one kid, you're losing the whole nation, which is all of your children, because Abraham is the father of the Israelites.
Awesome. Okay. So that sorry, that there's something special about Abraham here. Abraham, as literal father, gets what it is to lose a child, but he also is father of an entire people. Okay. Other thoughts about the shame and humiliation? Keep pushing that because it's weird. Benny.
Is it to say that if God is our parent, has God failed being a good parent to his children? Because if God had been, how can he be more hands-on? But he had his servants that had a connection with him. If he would have helped them to kind of guide the people in such a way that they wouldn't come to this situation where they are humiliated and shame. I mean, that how can a father let that happen? Isn't that your responsibility as a father to make sure that it doesn't?
Incredible, Benny, incredible. All right, so we have two big things. One is like maybe if God hadn't hired such bad babysitters, we wouldn't be such bad kids. And that's why it's important to find good babysitters or get a good daycare. Two, Benny, what you're pointing out here is everything that Abraham, and then we'll see the other patriarchs say here, we can read back into God's mouth, right? We can see that like God is, the writers of the Midrash are using Abraham and the patriarchs and Moses to put things into God's mouth that they're not quite comfortable putting in God's mouth. The God, you should feel shame and humiliation that this happened. The God, this is like, and we saw that a little bit last week, right? That God's first thing was like, oh, what are the nations going to think of me? And that here it's Abraham saying there's shame and humiliation about destruction. And that the normative way of reading the destruction of in Jerusalem is we were destroyed for our mistakes, right? We were destroyed for our sins. And so perhaps the shame and humiliation is that like we've done so badly that we've been destroyed, and that's something we should feel guilty about. That's something we should internalize as our own failures. Okay, y'all, every class I teach is 3 hours long in my head, and that is like basically never true anymore. During the semester, I get to teach 3 hour long classes, but we've got 25 minutes left and we've got so much incredible text. I'm going to run us through some of this text quickly. I'm going to run us through this really weird, very cool thing where the alphabet comes and testifies against us. And we're not going to talk about it, but I just want to introduce you to it. And then we'll jump back into discussion in a minute with the patriarchs. Okay. So here God answers Abraham and he says, why is this the case? Because your children sinned and violated the entire Torah and the 22 letters that are in it. And the proof text that God brings here is from Daniel 9:11, which is this incredibly powerful penitential prayer offered by Daniel. The proof text is V'chol Yisrael avu et Toratecha, and all of Israel has violated your Torah. The way we get this idea of all 22 letters is from the et in that quote, the second to last word, which is a totally normal word. It appears most of the times that we have direct objects. It is not something that is like screaming out your shuni. It's not something that says, I need to be interpreted. And yet, here we are interpreting it. Et starts with an aleph and it ends with a taf, right? So first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. From that, using this quote, we say, not only had they violated the entire Torah, they've also violated all the letters from aleph at taf. Okay. So, continuing, Abraham said before the Holy One, blessed be he, oh yeah? Is that true? Master of the universe, who will testify against Israel that they violated your Torah? Which is really cool. Like Abraham's like, you say that? This is true? Prove it. Prove it and I don't trust you, God, on this. I need eyewitnesses. Which is a crazy thing to say, but okay. God responds, no worries. I've got hordes of witnesses. So God says, let the Torah come and testify against Israel. Immediately, the Torah came to testify against them. And Abraham said to the Torah, BT, my daughter, you have come to testify against Israel that they have violated your mitzvot, and you have no shame before me. Remember the day that the Holy One, blessed be He, circulated you among the nations, and they did not want to accept you until my descendants came to Mount Sinai and accepted you and honored you. And now you've come to testify against them on the day of their distress. And the Torah gets a little bit embarrassed. Once the Torah heard this, it stood to one side and did not testify against them. So this is a story that appears in a number of places in the Talmud and the Midrash of that God offered the Torah to all 70 nations and nobody wanted it until finally God offered the Torah to Israel and we accepted it. And Abraham's pulling this out and saying, hey, Torah, you're going to testify against us when we've done this to you? This is coming back once again to this covenantal relationship idea, right? Like, we've got something going on, Torah. Like, you can't testify against the Jewish people. Like, I know your mom. We've grown tomato plants together, whatever it is. Like, we are too close. We've had too long of a relationship, and I've done favors for you. You got to do favors to me. And you gotta recuse yourself from this trial. And the Torah says, yep. And I mean, it's just incredible, right? Thinking about the power relationships here, where God's saying, Torah, do this. And Abraham's like, no. And the Torah listens to Abraham rather than God. The other thing I want to point out here, and we'll see this language repeated as with other bits, is Abraham refers to the Torah as BT, as my daughter, and that we'll see this family thing, this child thing keep coming up. Okay, so the Torah is not going to do it. The Holy One said, blessed be He, said to Abraham in the next box, all right, no Torah, let the 22 letters come and testify against Israel. Immediately the 22 letters came, Aleph came to testify against Israel that they violated the Torah. And Abraham said to that letter, to Aleph, which, I mean, for any of you who are like video people, I would love to see the like stop motion video of this Midrash, but Aleph comes to testify, and Abraham says to it, Aleph, you are the leader of all the letters, and you come to testify against Israel on the day of their distress. Remember that day that the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed Himself on Mount Sinai and began with you, saying, Anochi Hashem Elochecha, saying, I am the Lord your God. And that word, the Anochi there, begins with Aleph. And no other nation other than my descendants accepted you, and you come to testify against my descendants. So with the Aleph, Abraham's using the same reasoning he used with the whole Torah. And the Aleph's like, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Didn't mean to offend. The Bet, we tell a very similar story. Bet comes to testify. Abraham says to it, BT, once again, that my daughter, you've come to testify, but my descendants are all diligent in the 5 books of Torah, and you're the head of the Torah. Because as we know, the Torah begins with Bet, right? Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. And the Bet's like, oops, yeah, you're right. But there's also, I mean, there's such a strong claim here with Abraham saying, like, my descendants kept the Torah. The whole problem is we didn't, and that's why we were destroyed. Abraham's not bringing any witnesses to his case. He's just saying we kept it, and Bet's agreeing that Abraham is like almost sneakily changing the story that God's given to us. Yifeh. And then we have the final letter is going to come. Gimel comes, and we get this BT language again, this my daughter language, and the reasoning that Abraham uses is that we've kept the commandment of tzitzit, which begins with Gimel. Gidelim taseh lach. Make yourself twisted threads. And because which G starts with Gimel, which starts with that letter, and therefore because we've kept this letter with this mitzvah, which starts with Gimel, of course, Gimel stands aside, and all the letters saw that Abraham had silenced them. They were ashamed that busha, that shame word that Abraham was experiencing earlier. They were ashamed and stood by themselves, and they did not testify against Israel. Cool. All right, I wanted to run you through that because it's so wonderful and so weird. But I also wanted to run you through that so we could get to this part, which is my favorite. So we have 15 minutes, and we're going to see what Abraham says, what Isaac says, and what Jacob says to try and convince God to have mercy. They're asking for mercy, and God will not respond to any of them here. Moses will have something similar. I didn't bring it for you all. And then next week, we'll get yet another person coming. We'll get Rachel. And when Rachel comes, God's going to respond to her. God's going to cry with her. And so the question I've got for you before I'm going to read all of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob for you right now. The question is, what are these three trying to prove? What is their strategy? Why is it not good enough? Why does it fail? What's lacking in each of their strategies that God will not respond to them? Cool. All right, so, and if you are accidentally not on mute right now, you probably should be on mute. Thank you. Immediately, Abraham began speaking before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said, Master of the universe, when I was 100 years old, you gave me a son. When he achieved cognition, when he grew up and was a 37-year-old man, you said to me, sacrifice him as a burnt offering before me. And I became like a cruel person to him and had no mercy on him. Rather, I myself bound him. Will you not remember this on my behalf and have mercy on my descendants? All right, really weird. And I'm going to ask you guys to make sense of it for me in a minute. Isaac comes now, the bound kid, and says, Master of the universe, when my father said to me, God himself will see to the lamb for a burnt offering, my son, I did not delay the fulfillment of your words, meaning I understood that I was the burnt offering, and I was bound willingly upon the altar and extended my neck under the knife. Will you not remember this on my behalf and have mercy on my descendants? All right. So Abraham says, I suppressed my mercy and became cruel, and for that reason, you need to show mercy. Isaac says, I wasn't merciful towards myself. I chose to sacrifice myself, and for that reason, you need to have mercy. And Jacob comes and says, Master of the universe, did I not remain in Laban's house for 20 years? When I departed from his house, the wicked Esau encountered me and sought to kill my children, and I endangered my life on their behalf. Now they are delivered into the hands of their enemies like sheep to slaughter, after I raised them like chicks and suffered the travails of child raising on their behalf. as most of my days I experienced great suffering for their sake. Will you not now remember this on my behalf, to have mercy on my descendants? I love this so much. It is so cool. So what does each of them bring? What is the example of Abraham? What is the example of Isaac? And what is the example of Jacob? How are they trying to convince God? What are they asking God to do? These are three very different paradigms that are put forth before us. And as I said before, right, we don't think this literally happened. We don't need to read Midrash as if the writers expected us to think this literally happened. Rather, they're writing these specific stories. They're writing in this specific way to teach us something. That they're putting forth an example so that we get from that example something. So what is the example of Abraham? What is the thing that Abraham's saying God needs to do because Abraham did? What is the example of Isaac and what is the example of Jacob? Okay, Sylvia.
Oh, well, their arguments, all three of them, have something in common, which is, I did this for you, so you do this for me. It's like this bargaining chip that they have, rather than, oh my God, it's my whole people, it's my kids you're trying to kill. What? So then we remember in what we were talking about before, is that God cried. Are any of these men crying?
Fantastic. Okay, so God brought these people because they know how to cry, right? That's what we saw in the beginning of this Midrash. God brought up these four know how to cry. And yet these four come and said, like, listen, I suffered, you can suffer. Okay, cool, interesting. Stuart.
Trying to tie all these three together, I think they're playing with the concept of the merit of the ancestors, the sacrifices of the ancestors accruing merit for future generations. And I think that was like a popular, rabbinic, belief that the patriarchs and matriarchs had accrued merit. And, it's time to cash in the chips. So, God was reneging on the deal in a way.
Yefei, that there's it's like almost a continuation of the covenantal relationship, and that these three are like, listen, I did this stuff, I suffered, and so like, be nice to my descendants. Okay, cool. So we've got from Sylvia and Stuart ways of understanding all three of these together. I want you all to pick them apart. I want to know how specifically Abraham is different from Isaac, is different from Jacob. What is each of them saying? Benny?
Well, I find that they lack maybe a little bit of compassion to God's disappointment in humanity. I mean, God has been trying to tell us humans how to live, and given the Torah was the blueprint, how to make a way of fulfilling mitzvot, a way to come close to God. And that notion has been rejected all the time, and neither of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is acknowledging that. It's not giving any credit to God for that failure. Because if they would, I think I hope that they're trying to say is they want compassion from God. So God will save them. But to gain compassion, you might also have to kind of admit that we have some blame in this. It's not just that God is not holding up his bargaining chip. So
Interesting.
I'm speaking on behalf of God now. Yeah.
Yefei. Okay, so there's something really interesting where what we just had was a court trial with all those letters with the Torah. Then we move out of the court trial, but Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still trying to hold God to account. That they're not grabbing God's metaphorical hand and like passing him the tissues and bringing him a babka. That they're like, hey, I suffered, you owe it to me, where's the mercy? They're still making demands of God. And Benny, you're like, that's just not how you treat somebody. That you have to like, these guys should be able to look at God hurting and sit with God in his hurt. And that is where mercy comes from, rather than accusation. Interesting. All right, but nobody's picked apart these three for me. I'm going to keep asking you until somebody steps up and does it. What's different about Abraham from Isaac and Jacob? Yeah, got you. Go for it.
I don't know if I go on your way, but something you said, when we suffer, God owes us something?
Yeah.
God owes us?
So that seems, yeah, right. That seems to be what Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are saying. Yeah, keep going.
I don't know, because no, that's my question. No.
Yeah, it's very weird that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are coming in being like, I suffered, and so you owe me. And
That's it.
one way to interpret it seems to be like, I made sacrifices, and so you, God, also have to make sacrifices. Follow my example and like suppress your desires the way I have. But that's weird. That doesn't quite make sense. Rosalind and then Ellie.
I don't know what you're trying to elicit, but Abraham and Jacob are alike in one way, that Isaac the bridge isn't. They travel for fulfillment.
Okay.
Abraham is the Lech Lecha guy. He's willing to leave Mesopotamia or wherever it is to go to the promised land. And Jacob, for the sake of survival, is willing to go to Egypt. And Isaac is, kind of the guy who comes back and stays at home. And I've heard Midrashim where he doesn't talk to his father again, which under the circumstances doesn't seem too outrageous. But Abraham is like the surviving person, generation, whatever you want to call it. And but in different ways, Abraham starts the whole thing, but if you're connecting them to Jeremiah and Lamentations, you got to think about starting over, which for me has always been the major theme of Jewish history.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so there's a really cool midrash that is not this one, is a different petichta within Lamentations Rabbah that talks about exile, that talks about exile is okay, that exile is something that we can even celebrate because our forefathers did exile. That exile is something that Abraham did, and Isaac did, and Jacob did. And like somebody was saying, was it Stuart, saying about the merit of the patriarchs, that exile is somehow, it's cleansing. Exile is that moment where you grow and change and have your whole like Bildungsroman thing happening for you. It's not something that you need to view so negatively. And Rosalind, I think you're getting towards that, where Abraham and Jacob are saying, okay, I left, I changed, it was okay. And God, like, you don't need to be scared of exile. It's almost getting towards what Benny was talking about. It's almost getting towards a sitting down on the floor and holding God's hand and offering him a babka. Okay. Interesting.
One interesting thing about the way we celebrate Tisha B'Av is we're looking mostly at the first exile, the Jeremiah one, where we came back and got the temple back again.
Yeffe.
but we're also looking, and I think the dates are supposed to be similar, if not identical, at the second exile, where we didn't come back, unless you want to count this generation as the ones who came back.
Okay, awesome, cool. And that's something that's this big shift between Lamentations and Lamentations Raba, is it goes from a one-time event to the story of Jewish history. The story of us getting an exile and return and exile, return and exile. Okay, really quick, Ellie, and then Benny, and then I'm going to close for you.
Okay, mine is really quick. Yeah, just thinking that what's connecting these three, in my opinion, is that that there's the three of them are begging for their children, which God told them that Abraham, he said, if you do this to your child, I will liberate your children, and so on and so forth. And by the end, you know, Jacob too, he's going into Egypt and asking God, hey, have mercy on our children, because our children is what you promised to save Israel.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, okay, awesome. Yeah, Benny, and then I'll close.
Yeah, I was thinking that actually God was the one that saved Isaac. It wasn't Abraham. So he's making himself hero here, Abraham, in this Midrash. But the fact was the angel that said stop. It was God that intervened on the angel's behalf, because Abraham is saying, I bound him, but if the angel hasn't, we don't know. The story doesn't really tell what would have happened if the angel wasn't there. So God was to say, actually, it's Isaac belonged to me. You all belong to me. So God gave the Rahmanas in that situation, even if Abraham is kind of pointing out that he owes him something. He was already paid at the event itself. So I mean, so to come here and claim it is kind of trying to look away from what really happened.
Interesting. And yeah, by far the weirdest one here is Abraham, because Abraham says like the bargaining chip is that I became cruel and had no mercy, and therefore you need to have mercy. It's almost like I went against my fundamental nature by having no mercy, and so you need to go against your fundamental nature by having mercy. It's almost like this weird switcheroo thing going on. Okay, so title of this course is Teaching God to Cry. God's brought the three patriarchs and Moses in order to cry, and they don't get God to cry. And instead we have this like tense like negotiation. We sat through a trial, and now we're making accusations against God.
Mm-hmm.
And they're fair, and we have the merit of the patriarchs, and we have suffering that's happened, but none of this is getting God to cry. None of this is changing anything. None of this is getting us to a point of the compassion we're asking for. Next week, we're going to read Rachel, and what she says and the way God responds to her is very, very different. It works. Spoiler alert. So what I want to leave you with is thinking about the point in the Tanakh where we've had negotiations with this and seen God as other. Like a bunch of you mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah. We have all these points where we don't try to understand God. We see God as other, and we see God as someone that like you can negotiate with or hold to a covenant or whatever, but the God is not one of us, which God isn't, but God isn't someone you have compassion for. God isn't somebody that you feel for. And the incredible thing about this Midrash is it's asking us to have compassion for God. It's saying, okay, the way that you get somebody to have compassion for you is by having compassion for them. Okay. So I hope to see you all next week. And it's an incredible Midrash. Many, many thanks for all you showing up today. And if you have your theses you haven't shared with me yet, please email them to me. Y'all should have my email from the source sheet. And I'll see you next week. Shabbat shalom.
See you. Shabbat
Shalom.
shalom.
Shabbat
Okay.
shalom. That's Monday. Shavua tov.
Shavua tov, shalom.
Oh, is it Shabbat shalom?
Shalom.
Shalom.